Hey guys, so today we are going to talk through adaptation and evolution. So I know that when you hear me say the word evolution, immediately some of you might want to stop listening because of the fact that there is definitely controversy surrounding the concept of evolution, specifically in regards to a lot of religious beliefs. And I am not trying to convince you that your ancient ancestor is a chimpanzee. I am not trying to say that creation isn't valid, and I am definitely not trying to have any theological debates or issues here, because in reality, the term evolution doesn't mean what a lot of you have been taught to believe that it means. In the actual scope of the course that you're taking, when we say evolution, we're talking about how animals adapt and survive over time. So small micro changes that allow an organism to become better suited to the environment and therefore survive, reproduce, pass on their genetic information, and then give their children the likelihood of also having that trait. So it's really about survival and reproduction. It's not necessarily about tracing anything back to your ancestral heritage. So evolution is a theory that describes the change in an animal population over time. So we're talking about how things have descended from ancient organisms, but what I mean by that is how they have adapted and how small changes have resulted in all of the species that we see today. So for instance, if you have an animal that has a physical camouflage adaptation, it would be more likely to survive, find a mate, and their children would be likely to inherit that genetic trait as well. And then over time, if you see this continuing, you may end up with an offshoot of a species population that is now physically different or has this camouflage as a major trait. So the idea of evolution was first proposed by a man named Charles Darwin. We call him the father of evolution. He was born in 1809. He was British, and he is credited as being the father of the evolutionary theory. But before Charles Darwin could do his work, he was really impacted, and his thinking was really shaped by many other scientists of his time. So I've shown you guys here a couple of them. So James Hutton and Charles Lyell, they were the ones who proposed the idea that the earth is actually shaped over a very long period of time. So previously there was something called the young earth theory, which proposed that the earth was actually relatively young, and it didn't allow for the understanding of how things could adapt and change over a very long period of time. And after these gentlemen's work, it then became more acceptable to understand that the earth is actually millions of years old, and that would allow for these micro changes over time to result in the development of new species. There was a guy named Thomas Malthus. He focused on human population growth, and he came up with the idea that population actually increases a lot faster than the food and supplies available to those. So then survival of the fittest takes over, where you are then being forced to adapt or possibly die out if you can't compete. This actually plays really well into what we are seeing in the world today in terms of COVID-19 and the coronavirus in places like Italy and in some cases New York City, where the amount of people who are presenting with these symptoms actually outnumbers greatly the amount of equipment and medical help available to people. And that was all proposed by Thomas Malthus originally, that human population will eventually be larger than the supplies and the equipment available to those populations. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he was the first person to really come up with a theory of evolution, although incorrect, that tried to explain how things have descended over time. So Jean-Baptiste Lamarck presented the idea that giraffes, for example, have very long necks because over time they stretch their necks out to reach higher and higher leaves, and then when they had babies, their babies were then born with long necks. He was trying to explain how things changed over time, but his mechanism for that change was incorrect. We know that if I go to the gym and work out tons and tons and build huge muscles, I'm not going to have a muscly baby. That's not how life works. However, he was still attempting to explain how we see changes in populations and pass genetic information on from parent to offspring. We just know that it's not actually acquired traits. They're genetic traits. Georges Cuvier was a paleontologist. He was the first one to really look at fossil evidence in terms of extinct species and connecting extinct species to the survival of modern day organisms. So therefore, the more fit survive and reproduce, and those who are not fit tend to die out. And then a guy named Alfred Russel Wallace, who independently on his own came up with a hypothesis very similar to Darwin. I wouldn't say they were necessarily friends, but they knew of each other and they communicated back and forth via letter. And Darwin actually read some of Alfred Russel Wallace's work, and that inspired him to then write on the origin of species, which was his major work describing this evolutionary theory. So Charles Darwin's voyage happened in 1831 aboard a ship called the HMS Beagle, Her Majesty's ship. And it set sail around the world, specifically to a place called the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos has become this famous spot then for understanding how evolution happened over time. And it was very specific based on the terrain of the Galapagos. So if you look at this picture, you can see all of the, many of the Galapagos Islands. And you can also see that their climate and their terrain and their vegetation is very different from island to island. And this was huge for Darwin because it allowed him to look at tons of little micro environments that were all very close together in terms of proximity. And yet it allowed for so many different adaptations to actually exist. And you could really study how environment dictated the trait of the animal and how that survival happened. So across these islands, what he ended up seeing was that specifically in two different species, so finches and tortoises, the physical adaptations of those animals directly connected them to the island where they lived or the food source that they needed to eat. So for finches, he looked at the beak shape and size, and that specifically went back to the vegetation and food source available to that bird on the individual islands where you'd find them. And based on what was there, it dictated the physical shape of the beak, which meant that animals that didn't have that adaptation were likely being outcompeted and then dying out or finding some other place to then have to live. For tortoises, it was about shell size and shape. And again, it came down to the terrain of the island and the needs of that animal for survival. So you can see a diagram here showing you some of the different tortoises. And if you look at their neck and shell specifically, you can see some serious adaptations based on the islands and their needs on that particular island. So for instance, the Hood Island saddleback shell, that allowed for the neck of that particular tortoise to be able to stretch for higher and higher vegetation because it didn't necessarily come quite up over the head like it does in, say, the Isabella Island. Here are your finches. Again, as you work your way through this image, you can see how the food source of the bird played a major role in determining then what kind of beak or bill that particular bird would have. So for instance, things that were eating mainly plant life would have beaks specific for things like crushing versus something that was eating mainly animal food, so maybe insects or something, would have a very different type of beak necessary for that type of survival. All of these observations then led Darwin to come up with this hypothesis for why he's seeing such variation across the Galapagos Islands. And what he first came up with was this idea that things tend to be suited to the place where they live, so suited to the environment. And so animals that were dying out were the ones who were the least well-suited. And so he saw that variance can be inherited. So what that means is these variations, these traits are able to be passed on from parent to offspring. And that means that the offspring is going to be more likely to have this trait, pass it on to their children. And over time, over long periods of reproduction, you're going to see these traits coming forth as a characteristic of that particular animal group, and over time could lead to speciation. So that leads us to the idea of natural selection. So natural selection is where the most fit organisms survive and reproduce. And this happens based on survival of the fittest, based on being well suited to the environment you specifically live in. There is something called artificial selection, which is where it's a man-made selection. So men can pick traits that they believe are more desirable and breed. So think dog breeding, right? So if you want a dog that's hypoallergenic, you would breed things like a poodle with a type of dog that maybe had a specific behavioral trait that you really like. Maybe it's good with kids, or it's really smart, something like that. And that's how you're getting these intermixed breeds like golden doodles and labradoodles. So that's artificial selection. Natural selection, those selections of valuable traits are happening based on the environment. So 4 principles of natural selection. So the 4 principles of Darwin's theory: the struggle to survive, variation, survival of the fittest, and descent with modification. So the first one, struggle to survive. What that tells us is that more organisms are being born than can be supported by the environment. This kind of goes back to that theory we talked about earlier that really influenced Darwin, where human populations will outgrow the resources. Same thing with animals. Way more offspring are being produced than can survive. If you're thinking fish lay hundreds of eggs a lot of times, depending on the species, at a time. There is no way that all of those are going to then survive and reproduce, but they are still being born. Okay? So then young organisms must struggle to fight in order to survive. Therefore, the strongest tend to survive and reproduce. The idea of variation. So if you have tons of eggs or tons of offspring, each offspring will be slightly different in terms of genetics. You are not exactly the same as a sibling. So all of those variations will lead to some traits being more desirable or better suited to the environment than others. Those tend to survive, reproduce, and pass on that genetic information. Survival of the fittest, again, same thing. More fit, more adapted, more likely to survive. And then lastly, descent with modification, which is the principle that living species have descended with changes from other species over time. So again, this idea of an ancestral species, certain organisms have more desirable traits. They tend to survive and reproduce and pass that trait on. Over time, it is very likely that those traits speciate into a new species, a new group of organism that are characterized by these favorable adaptations. So this kind of covers microevolution versus macroevolution and the idea of small-scale changes versus these larger pathway changes. So I'm going to skip over this slide. I won't focus on it very heavily on a quiz or anything like that, but I have included it here for those of you who plan on taking college bio with Mrs. Glover. These are some concepts that you might want to familiarize yourself with prior to getting to her. And it's the different types of selection. So, for example, directional selection is the idea of a really uncommon phenotype or like a mutation being more favorable, and then that gets passed on. So if you want to look through these, please feel free to do so if you plan on taking college bio. So then last thing we want to talk about is the evidence of evolution. So how do I know that evolution has taken place? And again, not trying to necessarily tell you what you have descended from, but trying to show you how adaptations can lead to organism survival or extinction in cases where that organism doesn't have favorable adaptations. So adaptations being the first one, what traits does it have that make it fitted? Anatomical similarities, comparing the DNA, and then lastly, fossil evidence. So for your adaptations, there are 3 major types: structural, behavioral, and automatic. So these types of adaptations have to do with whether they're physical or something in like the behaviorisms of an organism, and then how does that interact with making it better suited to survive its environment. Well, I'm trying to get this to switch. There it goes. Okay. Well, y'all have to bear with me because apparently I have to tap my screen in just the right way. I'm doing this on an iPhone, by the way. Okay, so we're just going to look at it this way. Structural adaptation, behavioral, and physiological adaptation. So structural adaptation is something physical. So, for instance, having webbed feet if you like to swim, or if you're an animal that needs to survive in the water. Behavioral adaptation would be things like migration. Do you fly south in the winter in order to avoid extreme cold? And then physiological adaptation would be an automatic internal response. So, for instance, if you have a dog or a cat, their coats tend to become thicker and warmer in the winter months than they do in the summer, where they would then shed that underlayer. That's not something the dog or cat thinks about. It happens automatically in response to the environment. So then I'm going to skip through these. These are giving you examples of those types of adaptations, and you're welcome to look through them. So things like bird calls, etc. And then you can talk about quills on a porcupine. So things for protection, the color of the fur, or the thickness of the fur for some animals. And then leading us then down to these. So structural adaptations like mimicry, warning colorations, etc. So these are colorations or skin adaptations. So mimicry is mimicking another species. Warning coloration would be if you are poisonous, you tend to be more brightly colored. So think like poison dart frog, because it warns a predator like, hey, you probably don't want to mess with me. Other types of adaptations based on predation. So the development of toxins, bad taste, spines, a hard protective shell, things like that. Okay, so anatomical similarities. So that's going to lead us to homologous and analogous structures. So homologous and analogous structures refer to body parts and how they are evolutionarily linked to other related organisms. So a homologous structure are body parts that are constructed from the same bones but may serve different functions. So if you were to dissect and look at the bone structure in the forelimb, so like think arm, of things like, okay, a human, a horse, a cat, a bat in their wing, you would actually see the same bones, slightly differing in size and positioning, but the same general bone structure because they are all related. If you are looking at these homologous body structures, even though the bone structure is the same, that does not necessarily mean they have the same function. So for instance, my arm does not serve the same function as a bat's wing, which definitely does not serve the same function as a fin on a whale. But then your analogous structures are going to be things that have the same function, but not the same origin. So homologous structures can show evolutionary linkage. Analogous structures do not. So for instance, a butterfly's wing and a bird's wing and a bat's wing. They're all used for flying. They do not have the same musculature, the same bone structure, the same anatomy. So that does not necessarily show some type of evolutionary link. They just happen to have the same function for that appendage. Vestigial structures are structures that really don't have a useful purpose at all anymore in the organism. Some people like to use the example of the appendix, because you could have your appendix removed and you could live just fine for the rest of your life. If you look at the X-ray imaging on some whales, they actually have bone structure for pelvis and femur, even though they don't have legs. So again, vestigial structures, they kind of point to being necessary in a evolutionary ancestor, but not necessarily in the modern day organism. Maybe we can swap. There we go. So DNA and RNA similarities, you guys have all probably seen those diagrams where it shows you are 95% linked to a chimpanzee, and then they'll show you what it is with a mouse and with a bear and other animals. What they'll do is, when they did the Human Genome Project, you can look at the genetic information of different species and compare how many sequences are similar and shared. The more similar the sequences are, the more shared sequences, the more likely they are to be evolutionarily connected. That's all this is talking about. For fossils can show you changes. So, for instance, if you're looking at an ancestor of a turtle, you would maybe want to see how they were different and compare the fossil version to now to see what adaptations have happened over time to lead to the evolution of the modern organism. So then convergent, divergent, and coevolution. So these are just different types of evolutionary pathways that organisms could take. Convergent evolution is where two different species evolve to have similar characteristics over time. So if you converge, you kind of come together. So these are two very different species becoming more similar over time. And that typically is because they share an environment and they have the same environmental pressures on them. Divergent evolution is where two relatively similar species become more and more different over time. Something that has been used to explain why divergent evolution might happen is things like migration. So if animals move out of the environment to a new place and they live there long enough, you might start to see the emergence of different traits and adaptations for survival. So think back when you talked about Pangea and land being connected into large masses in geologic history, back when you guys took Earth and space science, it would have been a lot more feasible for organisms to move when all of the continents were connected. But then as those continents diverged and moved away from each other, that separated the land masses from each other, resulting in much more drastically different environments and then different environmental pressures on organisms that may at one point in time have been more similar. And then lastly, coevolution is one species evolving due to changes in another species. So you might see this in a predator-prey population. If something changes in the predator population, the prey might have to evolve to adjust. And then lastly, speciation. And this is how a new species emerges. So the emergence of new species over time through evolution. So this can happen based on a couple of different factors, but we refer to all of it as reproductive isolation, which is the idea of the separation of a population so that the organisms and the species or the members of that species can't reproduce together. So you can have behavioral, geographic, or temporal isolation. If it's behavioral, it means that their courtship rituals, the behavioral tactics that they use to find a mate, they don't line up anymore. So it's no longer allowing for those organisms to reproduce with each other. Geographic isolation, think a barrier, an ocean, a very large river, a mountain. In some cases, it's as simple as creating a highway that cuts through the center of a big forest, and the animals don't tend to cross that. And so now you're seeing a barrier between which organisms can and cannot reproduce with each other. And then temporal isolation would be different reproductive times. So for instance, if you have a bear species that lives in North America and a bear species that lives in Canada, and one goes through hibernation and the other doesn't, they are not likely to reproduce with each other because they could be reproductive at different times of the year. So that's the idea of temporal isolation. And that is the end of our PowerPoint. Please ask if you have questions. This was just a general overview of evolution and adaptation and how that can lead to speciation over time. For this week, I am asking that you guys work on assignments 1 through 3. We will do 4 and 5 next week, and then the week after that, you will do your final project. Let me know if you have questions. Hopefully this stuff makes sense, and if not, let me know, and we can do a Zoom meeting to go over it.